it doesn't project you.
So that's like 6.5 years? 6.5, I think.
Okay, welcome everyone. We are winding down our transportation seminar this term. So welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning and director of OTREC, the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium. Professor Kelly Clifton is unable to be here today. She's in Chicago on a bicycle-related project. But I am here instead. And we are winding down our special themed seminar this term on modeling. We are now our second to last one of the term, and today we're going to be focusing on freight modeling. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind everyone that we are webcasting the seminars, so when we get to the point of asking questions at the end, please use the microphones, hold the touch button, keep the red light lit while you ask the question. If you don't have a microphone that works, I will come around with this one. So those are our logistics. So without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Ann Goodchild. She's worked in the transportation field for more than 15 years. She got her PhD in civil engineering from UC Berkeley, and she's been a professor at University of Washington for the past 5 to 6 years. Yeah. I don't know if I did my math right there. She is currently the chair of the Seattle Freight Advisory Board and the paper review coordinator for the Freight Transportation Planning and Logistics and the intermodal committees for the Transportation Research Board. She's been involved in a number of projects, and she's going to give us, we've focused a lot so far in our modeling work in this seminar on personal transportation. She's going to give us the other side of that, very important side of the freight. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can I say this piece of paper? Thank you. So thank you for having me. Just going to grab one piece of paper out here. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm Ann Goodchild. I just live up the street in Seattle, but it's a pleasure to be here in Portland. And I was just saying to Miguel on the way over, it's amazing how different two cities can be that, might also be similar in a lot of ways. So it's neat to be in Portland. It really feels different from Seattle and way cooler. At least people dress way cooler here. So I submitted an abstract some time ago about what I was going to talk about. And that really focuses on a specific project that I have just completed for WashDOT, where we were looking at routing and how freight carriers and shippers make decisions about how freight might move, which specific roads they might take between A and B. So I will mention that briefly, but then about a week ago, Kelly asked me to talk at a fairly sort of detailed level about freight models and what the framework is, and what kind of state of the practice models look like, what their limitations are. So I'm going to try to do both of those things. So that might be a huge mistake, because I might be trying to cram too much in at one time, but hopefully some of it will sink in. So why do we build freight models? I will give an answer to that question. I'm going to talk about actually PSRC's truck model, which I think is a state of the practice, actually quite a robust truck model. PSRC is the MPO in the Seattle area. I will talk about a couple of ways in which people are trying to move the state of the practice forward with freight modeling, what kind of elements they're trying to add or develop for those models. Some of the challenges and limitations, and what I think we're going to see moving forward with those models. So essentially, we're trying to figure out what volume of trucks we might see on various on links in the modeled area. So the primary output from these models is number of trucks on a link, okay, at a time of day, depending on how detailed that time of day is actually modeled by the model. Sometimes it's just a daily volume. Sometimes it's broken out by, say, 5 periods of the day. So why do we want to do that? Why do we want to do that? Yeah? Sorry. Am I screwing things up?
You drive from Alabama to California with a truckload of paper cups, and you can put it on the Union Pacific and bring it across for half the cost.
So what is PSRC going to do with their? So some people would say, well, right now we can go out and measure, right? We can go out and put out some counters and count how many trucks there are if we're interested in today's traffic, right? Usually we're interested also in kind of the long term, in what do we anticipate trucks travel is going to look like in 2030, 2040, which is a responsibility of PSRC to do long-term transportation modeling. So primarily, we model trucks because, at least at the regional level, or MPOs and planning organizations are required to. So they're required to plan using models and including freight in those models. So I think that's an initial challenge, right? If we have a very clear question that we're trying to ask, we can usually define a model that's good at answering that one question, right? But sometimes when our requirements for that model are broad, we get a little confused in exactly what's important to model, what we can ignore, right? And so I think one of the challenges to freight modeling is that while there is sort of one specific long-term application, we also kind of want these models to do lots of other things. And we want them to do neighborhood-level planning. We want to look at corridors. And we sort of have our primary objective of looking at regional truck traffic and how that might be changing over time, so that we can look at what congestion might look like in 2030, what delays to trucks might look like in 2040. And that's our primary objective. But then we come up with additional requests. We think, well, now that we have this model framework in place, we actually kind of want to know something about truck emissions. What can we use this model for to look at in terms of emissions? But it wasn't necessarily designed to do that. So most of these agencies, like Metro and PSRC, have a lot more experience developing passenger models rather than freight models. So most of the time what I find is that the sort of state of the practice is, well we're quite knowledgeable, and at least on PSRC's behalf, we have a more sophisticated model that models passenger travel. And freight, or in a lot of cases just specifically truck modeling, is something of an afterthought, or at least it's a newer element of their model. And many of the people using those models in those agencies aren't particularly familiar with freight, nor how those models actually model freight. We do have reasonably limited data on truck movements. People agree and disagree about exactly how limited that is. Limited is not a well-defined word. But there's certainly, we don't have, in the city of Seattle, up until last year, when we did vehicle counts, we did not get a truck count. We did not classify those between, axles. So, City of Seattle hasn't historically had even truck counts. We use an estimate. We take a percentage of the trucks and we estimate. But in most places, we don't have truck counts. And I think there's been a gap between sort of models in the literature, right, that we might theorize about and that we might apply to a limited example where we had a specific data set. Or we might think if we had X and Y information, we'd really like to use this kind of structure. And the ones that are actually functional, being used in decision making at planning organizations. And I think that gap is closing, and you know, some agencies are more aggressive than others about adopting new techniques. But that work is ongoing, right? And so most agencies, PSRC as an example, are currently trying to add complexity or insight into those models that hasn't existed. So again, we want truck volumes and locations as our sort of simplest output from those models. In general, we assume for a regional truck model that the sort of structure is the same as passenger modeling. So we have trips that are generated in a zone and trips that are attracted in a zone. Okay? And in general, we assume that they're generated by employment. So we look at employment numbers in that zone in a particular NAICS code sometimes in an industrial classification. And you know, we multiply that by a number. And that's how many truck trips we estimate are generated from that zone. And then also we use a different parameter, but we attract based on the same thing, based on employment. We usually have a gravity model. So we assume that more trips go to places closer by than farther away. That's not a great assumption for all of freight. There might be sort of components of freight that might be reasonable for, where we have a regional distribution center and delivery. Okay, but not all of freight, say, for example, port traffic has that kind of pattern. We often ignore tours or have to have a specific separate component for building tours because they're a complicated thing to try to do. And often we don't have any mechanism for trying to capture intermediate stops between the sort of identified origin and destination. And sometimes we ignore return trips, or sometimes we try to capture them, and we usually assume there's some percentage of empty trips. Sometimes that's based on carrier attributes, sometimes not. So there's a lot of limitations to sort of a state of the practice regional truck model. What are we trying to model? Well, we're trying to model a supply chain. Or part of the supply chain that's occurring in this urban region, that the MPO is responsible for. So I just showed an example of here's a wood commodity chain. Here's some trees being grown, and they go to a pulp mill or a sawmill, and eventually they get used by people in paper or furniture, and eventually they're disposed of. So I think it's a fundamentally kind of different framework than passenger travel in a region, fundamentally different drivers, fundamentally different sensitivities. And so our approach has generally been, well, let's take this passenger modeling framework, let's see if we can modify the parameters for freight and move forward from there. And it's not a particularly elegant match. So certainly one of the things people are trying to do is either modify existing frameworks to try to add some of these intermediate facilities, different behaviors for different commodities, or some people are thinking about sort of fundamentally different frameworks for how we might model freight. Of course, that's difficult for an MPO that has invested decades and probably millions of dollars into a tool that they're using and is embedded in their decision-making process. It's not easy to find the money to do something new, and then sort of to adjust all of the processes that are used internally to make decisions. It's a huge job. And the other thing we're trying to model are tours. So yes, on the passenger side, we talk about trip chaining, and we recognize that as a complicated thing to try to capture. But the tours in goods movement are, we don't call them trip chains because they don't have sort of different tasks that occur at those different stops. And they have sort of fundamentally different characteristics than passenger tours, unless you're like a newspaper delivery person and you're actually doing a freight tour. So in the past, we've tried to take this framework built on passenger modeling and sort of add a touring component. So generate some trips and then try to modify them to match this logic. So I'm going to talk about the PSRC travel model I mentioned because I think it is, given my knowledge of other MPO models, they have a truck model, and it works, and they use the output, and there are limitations, but those are sort of well understood, and I think it gives you an example of a state of the practice, actually, fairly good example of what a truck model in play currently looks like. So they try to model travel for the 4 counties of the Puget Sound. So I don't want to say state of the art. I want to say state of the practice, because there are more. The word sophisticated isn't really fair, but there are more sophisticated models, but they're not generally in North America in use for regional freight modeling. And we're going to try to look at how changes in the infrastructure will affect truck flows in the future, changes in employment, changes in land use, how we can expect that that's going to affect truck flow. And it interacts with their land use model. So there's I have a slide on this. So there's a land use model, then we have a travel model, and then they do 2 other things after that. One is they look at emissions using the travel model output, and then they also do a benefit cost analysis with the output from the travel model. So this is the land use model and the travel model. They take inputs from regional economic forecasts that are going to look at where population growth is going to occur, where employment is going to change. And so we're really focused on this piece here. Right? This is the actual travel model. And as I mentioned, as using the travel model output, they then do some emissions and some economic analysis. That's a separate step from that travel model. So here's the truck model is actually a separate travel model. So it operates by itself, separate from trip generation on the household and personal level, separate from how we generate employment in industrial classification. So we generate those, and then we look at truck traffic. And then trip assignment, so which roads they actually travel on, is done in parallel with passenger travel. Right, so commercial and passenger are handled separately, although they're assigned to the network in one step. Truck trips are generated and distributed and then assigned to specific routes. There's no mode choice in the truck model because there's just truck. Right? We're not looking at other freight modes like rail. We use TAS level employment to estimate truck trip generation. So, if there's 100 people in this zone employed in warehousing and distribution, and we multiply 100 by a factor, and that's how many truck trips we have generated from this TAS. And then there is a conversion. So when we actually do traffic assignment, a truck isn't equivalent to a car. We use a passenger car equivalent, so we use a factor to say, well, a truck is actually, a 1.5 or 2 cars when we look at traffic flow, because they drive a little slower and they take up a little bit more space on the road network. So the sort of basic unit, right, we don't do in the truck model, we don't do anything more refined than the TAS, or the traffic analysis zone. There's about 1,000 in the 4-county region, and PSRC is currently going through a process of about tripling that number. So they are, constantly improving the model, and will, in a reasonably short amount of time, have a much more detailed model. But the one that's currently being used, or was used for the 2040 work, had about 1,000 TASs. And we estimate truck trips just at that TAS level. So we don't know, it's not at establishment level or anything at finer level of spatial detail. So there's 5 time periods during the day, so we can generate trips, right, in the AM peak, in the midday, in the PM peak. So we do have a structure that allows us to look at 5 periods of the day. Okay, but within that period, everything is constant. And there are 3 truck types that we model. So we model volumes for these 3 types of trucks, basically sort of small, medium, and large trucks. So these are, tractor trailers, and then the light trucks are actually include commercial vehicles that are just cars. So taxis, ambulances. So the light category is actually very, very small. So most trucks that you would observe in the urban region are going to be medium trucks. So there's this factor, this magic factor, right, that lets us go from how many people are employed in this TAS with the 2-digit SIC code to how many truck trips are generated from this TAS. And that is estimated. So there's the ITE trip generation manual has truck trip generation rates, and PSRC has also done various other studies to try to estimate what that number is. So there's a few different sources that people use to try to estimate what those trip generation rates are. We actually don't have rates for construction and resources. There's no sort of system feedback. So the number of truck trips that we generate is fixed if employment stays the same, right? So if we make a change to the infrastructure and we just reduced travel times because we added a lane for at least some short period of time, we reduce the time it takes to get from A to B, there's no feedback to how many trips are generated. So there's no induction of demand, right? So the only way we can change the number of truck trips is by saying, well, employment is going to change in this region. Because the structure is right now that based on employment, we know how many truck trips there are. And it's not sensitive to sort of how the system is functioning and how long travel times are. And there are some special generators. So in addition to these TASs, we do have specific trip generation rates for like the Port of Seattle and some of the warehousing districts in southeast Seattle. And those are based on sort of one-off surveys or counts that are done regionally. So we do account for trips external to the 4-county region. So there's some trips generated and then attracted outside, and we use some national data. Transearch is some data you can buy that's based on the commodity survey. And then this is a specific study that was conducted in Washington to try to estimate what the volume of trips would be and what their distribution would be spatially. So validation, right, in the future, we can't do, but we can at least look at how, if we run the model for the current time period, how that compares to some counts we might be able to obtain locally. So that is done, and it's been validated for certain corridors for heavy and medium trucks, I-5, I know, and I think 509. So there's some specific places where we compare, how does the model look compared to current conditions. And there's been some analysis that they've done to try to look at the interaction with passenger cars and light trucks. And so I think validation is usually a difficult task when it comes to travel modeling. But there are some specific activities that they undertake annually to try to make sure that there's some reasonableness. So I mentioned that there's a gravity model approach, so TASs closer by get more trips. And these are estimated for specific truck classes because we have those 3 classes. So then we generate these trips. We know their origin TAS and their destination TAS, and we're going to apply them to a network. And that network is not the entire street network, but it is certainly in the case of trucks, it's all arterials and places that trucks probably want to drive, excluding home delivery. And so there is this traffic assignment so we combine the trucks and the cars back together again to do the traffic assignment. And so we can capture congestion effects. And all of the vehicles assigned to a link, have the same speed profile. There's no distribution. So, at morning peak, the link of 520 between I-5 and 405 has, the output we can look at is there's an average speed, okay, and that's obtained by everybody who travels on that link. There's not an inherent distribution that is captured by the model. And so we recognize that trucks probably, we believe they travel slower in some cases than passenger cars. So we get this, linked travel speed for a time of day, and then we say, well, trucks are going to travel 25% slower than that. So we just apply that. That's our estimate for truck travel speed on that link at that time of day. So, there is a model. It attempts to capture truck travel in the 4-county region. There are lots of regions who don't explicitly have a truck model, so they're not modeled at all, or make much more simplified assumptions. So a percentage of traffic is trucks. But there's obviously also some pretty significant limitations to what we can do with this structure. Okay? I have tried to use this model at sort of a less than regional scale. I think they're very comfortable with the results being used regionally. But if you want to try to identify a specific corridor, some of them are okay because they might be sort of isolated on the network. But some of them, in particular so we have a sort of parallel corridors, 167 and I-5, and there's a lot of truck traffic in that area. And sometimes we want to compare the two. And the sort of model developers and users are uncomfortable with it at that kind of scale. So there's some corridor level analysis, at least within the region, that we're not confident that the structure of this model can really capture. And so it limits our ability to look kind of at anything less than a fairly large scale, at least with respect to the model's scope. Truck trip generation is tied to employment. And so we've been trying to use the model to say, well, what is traffic going to look like if we make an improvement? Well, unless we run the whole suite, right, unless we go back to land use and make some assumptions about what that change is going to do to where employers locate, right, nothing changes. So the travel time goes down if that's the outcome, okay? But people don't choose to make more trips. And they might choose different roads because there's this dynamic traffic assignment, but the number of truck trips is going to stay the same, which is limiting. And then, there's very little what I would call supply chain detail in the model. So we're not explicitly modeling intermediate facilities. We don't have sort of different time sensitivities for different commodities. We don't have different numbers of truck trips at different times of day for different commodities, whereas we know some of these things are true. We know certain types of cargo travels at 4 in the morning, because it can and because there's no congestion there. So there's a lot of things that sort of we know are happening and aren't in the structure of the model, so it can't capture some of those effects, and we think it has sort of limited ability to capture behavioral changes amongst carriers. And why do we want that? Well, there's some policies that we're thinking about that are trying to affect carrier behavior and time of day and scheduling, and we really don't have a model, at least regionally, that has that built-in logic to be able to anticipate what the responses might be. So what are people? So this is a model in practice, and everybody who uses it recognizes its limitations. So there's also a whole world of people trying to develop new model frameworks and knowledge from data that will help us identify what those frameworks should be. And so I've sort of classified the 3 areas of research into supply chain models, tour-based models, and then sort of models that are trying to do it all. Because there's been work for decades on trying to improve the sort of touring component of freight models, because we know that that's substantially different from passenger travel. And there's many relationships that we know exist in the supply chain that if we had the data or when we have the data, we want to add that complexity to our models. So we're really trying to model these relationships between suppliers, shippers, transshipment, like as I mentioned, and try to get at kind of how decisions are made and who makes those decisions, so that if we try to affect a change, we can actually model that decision making and be policy sensitive. We're limited by the data sort of the knowledge that we have about all of those relationships. Some of them are well known, some of them are maybe we believe are true, but we don't have great data to support. And so certainly one of the challenges has been getting data, confirming ideas, building in that logic, and then also kind of having that data in the long term to actually support a model with that structure. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So this is the SMILE model, which is used in the Netherlands. And it's an example of, they've been using it for some time. It tries to capture a lot more of the sort of supply chain relationships and structure in that model. It actually, sort of accounts for the routing of flows through distribution centers. So it does some of that intermediate stops. And it actually is linked to an input-output model. So they're trying to get some of this feedback between, well, if we reduce the sort of cost of delivering, that's going to, that's an asset we're going to use somehow else. We might produce more, so that we can get at some of the interaction between sort of transportation system performance and then economic activity. And it's just an example. They're not the only people doing that. So one thing, I'm going to come back to this one. In terms of tour-based models, there's many of the models currently in use have a specific sort of tour subcomponent. And those are sort of necessary because of the complexity of like vehicle capacity, time, the capacity to actually make X number of deliveries in a day, depending on the dwell time and the number of stops. And this is just an example of the Texas Urban Commercial Vehicle Model that is explicitly trying to take those origins and destinations and then build tours out of them, right? Because our sort of standard framework doesn't actually, has trips going from one place to another place and then doesn't actually build them into tours. A hybrid model, an example is the Good Trip model, which again is actually in use, and many of these examples come from Europe. There's also the Mosaic model, I don't know, which is actually Portland-based. I don't actually know how much it's used. If anybody does, I'd love to hear about it. But I know that it's a framework that is both sort of has some supply chain elements and then this touring framework that's also built into there. So there are examples, there are people. I think there's some resource constraints in terms of how much progress we can make. And then also sort of a leadership. You kind of need a critical mass in a modeling framework. You need to invest a lot of time, and then people sort of need to have faith in it for a little while before it's of the quality that might be useful. So I'll come back to that one too. One of the things that's been happening in Washington is that they've realized we might also need to have some sort of hierarchy of models. And this goes back to sort of the comments I made at the beginning about, well, it depends on what your question is, right? We want a model because it is a simplification of reality, and we don't need it to, well, it can't, and we don't need it to hold all of the complexity of the real world. But there are cases where we want very detailed analysis of intersections, right, and stopping and starting, say, with emissions, okay? And then there's cases where a regional model is just fine, and we don't want to burden ourselves with all the complexity of modeling specific intersections. And so in Seattle right now for the 99 replacement, they're actually building a sort of intermediate facility, and it's specific to that project. But it's somewhere in between a sort of micro scale, intersection level, individual vehicle modeling, and the 4-county regional model, because we really, it's a sort of corridor example where both of those frameworks aren't exactly right. And so depending on what our applications are, I think we shouldn't believe that there's one supermodel that's going to do everything for us, but that there's probably a sort of hierarchy of needs, and we're always going to have some small-scale models for some questions that are particularly important. So where do we go from here? I think it's always important to come back to what's the application of this model. Is the insight it's going to provide to us worth the cost of building that model? And we should always have a pretty clear idea of what those outcomes are. Modeling is fun, but it's also expensive. And so we want to, I think it's always important to have a use analysis done. I think there's a lot of people struggling with sort of how do we either take the models that we currently have and try to kind of add some of this supply chain complexity. Do we throw that away and start entirely from scratch with like an agent-based model that has a fundamentally different approach? And those are dependent on what you're going to do with it, and also a question of resources. How much money and time and expertise do you have to actually start that work? But that's, I think, work that's ongoing, and I don't think anybody's cornered the market in terms of some supermodel that's going to solve all of our problems for us. Certainly there's a challenge of sustainable data sources, and if we are going to restructure the models or we are going to add commodity detail to them, we need to know what that is, and we need to be able to validate that. And so there's some cool new sources of data with GPS, and people are trying to wrestle with how do we get the information we want from that, and is that possible? But I think there's some interesting work going on here now too. And then resources. In Oregon, you guys have great statewide models compared to Washington, where we don't have a statewide freight model of any kind. And it's hard to go from nothing, to a model that's reliable and useful. That's many years of investment, and it's hard to take that on as an individual state or when budgets are tight. And so I think we should be thoughtful about how we can share and how we can develop these in concert so that it's not overly burdensome for any particular group. California, for example, is in the process of investing a lot in a statewide freight model. And so, as a Washingtonian, I want to learn as much as we can from that and see how we can benefit from their investment. And then I think validation is an ongoing challenge. It's hard in transportation, right, because the world is constantly changing. What does it mean to have validated it for last year? And so I think there's some good work going on trying to, in a cost-effective way, but then also a sort of statistically meaningful way, try to make sure these tools are actually going to, we can't ensure they are, but to the best of our ability, ensure that they're going to be able to capture the dynamics that we're using them and trusting them to. So I think I'm out of time. So I have two other slides, and those are about things that I've specifically been doing with my research group to try to forward this effort. So I'll answer your questions first, but then if we have time, I guess I can go back to those. Yeah.
So you said trip generation is based on employment.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering how significant the correlation is there. It seems like it might be other variables. You spoke about how other models try to capture those numbers.
Yeah, I think it is. Everybody recognizes that's pretty terrible, and that they're not very correlated. Specifically, we did some research on warehousing. So warehousing and distribution is actually, there's a lot of diversity. So in that category, okay, we have an two-digit SIC code, which at least narrows down the field. But there's still a lot of diversity within that. So with warehousing and distribution, self-storage is in that, and so is a regional distribution center for Safeway. So first of all, there's just a lot of diversity even within those categories about what kind of establishment they are. And then even within warehousing, we went and we asked a handful, so it was anecdotal, but we asked of the sort of 5 firms that we talked to, there's a very labor-dependent, high-throughput example, and then there's another group that's really a storage facility and has a third in that case of the number of trucks generated. So I think we know that we don't actually know how bad it is because we don't know the real number, but we can certainly point to examples that suggest it's bad, and we know that too, but we don't have, a comprehensive knowledge of what the true rates are and what causes them to vary. So we know it's not good, but we don't have a solution that's going to produce great trip generation rates. Certainly, I think we know that adding more detail, so being able to separate, storage from true cross-dock facilities, being able to separate their function a little bit more, can't hurt us in terms of being able to do a better job at pinpointing them. Yeah.
I was curious if there is a model, or if there's, I guess, any environmental components of any of these models, particularly in relation to climate change, and how that might affect freight networks or freight modes,
Right.
Railroad versus things like that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. What I've talked about is really planning-driven regional freight modeling. So some of those people are looking at emissions. And so, with PSRC, there's a sort of secondary model. So they take the output from the travel model, and then they can calculate emissions from that. So they could, it's a few steps in the iteration, but then they can go make some changes, calculate emissions. So they're certainly doing that, and I think are required to do that now I've seen, for a number of pollutants, I've seen them looking at greenhouse gas emissions, but also NOx, is what I've seen them output recently. So in the case of even regional travel modeling, yes, people are calculating emissions. I think if you're looking at the future and you're using a model that really doesn't have induced demand, that's a big weakness because in that case, any improvement in travel time is depending on exactly what speed you're traveling, but generally speaking, you're going to see a reduction in emissions. But you're potentially missing one of the, I think, key components, which is, well, actually, if you improve travel time, you're probably going to induce some demand, and we're not capturing that in our emissions. But then B, there's lots of very specific models that are looking at emissions for in different applications. So Miguel does some work in sort of routing and scheduling and looking at sort of emissions efficient routing and scheduling models. So that that's a sort of a more logistics model, and it's not looking at regional travel demand. But there's lots of more detailed applications where people are looking at emissions and trying to look at how it relates to speed and demand and stopping.
Would you say that, and would that change policies, for instance? Like if the model showed that there was one corridor, for instance, that had a lot of emissions and that those emissions were predicted to grow, have you ever seen, I guess, the policies say we're going to incentivize freight on rails because of this model? Yeah,
so I know, like ODOT, that's one thing they would like to be able to consider is, how do investments in road infrastructure compare to an investment in rail infrastructure, given part of their motivation is that there's an expectation that that has an emissions benefit. I think it depends on the culture and the priorities of the place and the organization, but there certainly are people who are interested in that. And I know in Washington they're working hard on improving their cost-benefit analysis process for freight, and one of the 5 elements that they will consider is emissions. So you have to. So I think emissions is being considered. I think it's the tools are sometimes simplified, and so perhaps missing some of the emissions or some of the complexity of modeling emissions. But I think we're trying to move in that direction. Yeah.
So I'm curious about the relationship between like private freight carriers and then government organizations trying to model and make policy decisions. So I'm wondering if private companies who do a lot of research into routing decisions and that, and if they maybe feel like they have the best, most efficient routes figured out, if they're a little more resistant to providing data, or if they're generally cooperative. And yeah, just wondered if you could speak to that relationship.
Yes. I would definitely call them generally cooperative. But I would also say that running a business means focusing on your objective, which is generally not include providing data to the government. And, it's time consuming. Giving someone data can take, 2 weeks of somebody's time. So it's not an easy ask all the time. So I think they have to believe that there's either a requirement, or there's some, there's a certain amount of goodwill, but I think they have to believe that it's in their interest to provide that information. So I think there's many examples. I work kind of individually with firms who provide data, and there's certainly partnerships at a higher level with government organizations and individual companies to provide data. But it's usually a lot harder than it sounds, because their data, we're scavenging that data, and it was collected or it was recorded for different purposes, and so it doesn't always translate into what we want it to be, and we end up, so if you get the data, it's still very time-consuming and costly to sort of understand where that came from, what its qualities are, and so I haven't seen it, really working fantastically well, and it's not because people haven't sort of recognized the challenges and tried to overcome them. You also run into a problem of just statistical significance. So, if you're trying to do something that's sort of academic and you want to be able to speak to the confidence you have in that data, it's very hard to do if you've just got volunteered information from people. And that's okay sometimes, and you can probably get, we did some work at the Port of Vancouver where we were asking every trucking company that visited the port to give us information. And we get, at the end of the day, maybe 80% of them to give us information, and it's all different. Some of them just tell you the number of trucks a day. Some of them actually have timestamps. Some of them don't give you information at all. And so you have to try to put them together. How do you take a number? So you have to tend to the least detailed data, because you can't really take your, we had 10 trucks a day and somehow allocate that to times of day. So you have to tend to the most general data that you have. And then, we can say, well, we probably got most of the detail. We got 80% of them. But it's hard to say, yes, we're going to make a decision based on this, and I'm confident this represents behavior. And so it's certainly worth doing, but it's harder than it sounds. Yeah.
Is asking the reason, and I must have missed this, the reason for excluding freight trips related to construction and resources in the modeling. Explain that a little bit.
I don't know. I know that there's suppression of a number of cells, because if there's a very small number, then we worry about confidentiality. So I know we tend to underestimate. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're just not counted or if there's some concern about using that data. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the tool-based modeling concept. So is your tool-based modeling concept applied to the traffic assignment stage by using optimization modeling approach, or is a logic modeling approach in activity-based modeling used?
So they vary. There are several different approaches. Normally you would build a tour before you do the traffic assignment. So they're generally at like the fleet level, you're building tours, and then that gives you new trip information that you would use in your traffic assignment. And they can be, I've seen very simple ones, like if I have any pairs of deliveries within a region, So, you know, the one I've seen is if they're less than 2 miles apart, we link them together in a tour, and then we check if we meet the capacity constraints. So in that sense, it's not optimized, and it's not, there's no, you know, value in the decision making. But then you can also, I've also seen ones where you sort of build an optimal tour. So you sort of give the, analytically, you input the 10 destinations, and then you actually build sort of, you know, a shortest path tour. So that would be optimal. And then I've also seen models where they're trying to capture more than just the travel distance. So, you know, there's time windows, or there's constraints on the deliveries that would be valued in the building of the tour. So there's quite a number, but they would all be done before the traffic assignment. Yeah.
You did speak a little bit about the difficulty of collecting data, but do you think there's an opportunity to kind of like leverage some of the infrastructure, like weigh stations for trucks, and like the increasing like cheapness of like GPS devices to get some more robust data in the future?
Yeah, there's certainly, we would all benefit if there was some significant investment in, you know, and you guys have, what's it called, your data portal? Yeah. So I mean, it's doable, and there's some you know, specific challenges to merging data of different sources that aren't always. I mean, you can do it, but it limits the quality of the data in the end. So there's some good examples. Temporal, I think, is one good example where we're working to a single place where we can bring lots of complementary data sources together. But there's some genuine challenges in trying to merge those, right? You know, like weigh and motion data. Okay, you know, we have data from a specific place from a sub-segment of trucks, and we have certain data elements in there. And they're not, you know, it's a different sort of sampling approach to, say, GPS data. So if you have, you know, your GPS data actually samples a different population, you might be able to get, you know, over the same period of time at the weigh and motion station, you know, you could compare the percentage of trucks that were in this data set and that one. You don't actually know if they're the same trucks. So there's some, you know, it's really very complicated, and I think it requires a lot of investment. And we should, I think that we could do that collectively, you know, if that's us as a country, or, you know, a bunch of states or an academic consortium, where we'd really need to invest in that and then continue to invest in that, and, you know, maintain that. And there just aren't a lot of opportunities to support that financially over the long term. And there's companies, you know, like INRIX, who take a lot of data sources and put them together and create new products. But they have a revenue stream, right, that they use to support that activity. And so sort of doing it without ever having a revenue stream, I think, limits how much investment you're going to have in it. And that, you know, limits the sort of the investment and the complexity of dealing with those data sources. So it's not, you know, it's not something you can just do in your spare time. It's something you'd really have to invest in, I think.
About 5 minutes if you wanted to highlight
great.
either research project.
So over the last 18 months, I've done a bunch of surveying, and 2 kind of different applications. And one of them was we have a framework for a statewide freight model in Washington, and one of the we have a model. It's just doesn't have a lot of detail, and we have, you know, some logic for how to route things between origin and destination, right? We use shortest path. So we say, you know, you're going from here to here, here's my network, and we use travel distance. You could use travel time. You could use cost, right, if you had some cost per mile or cost per hour for routing those trucks. And that's a very standard approach. And so we got some pushback on that, which was, well, I don't think that's a reasonable assumption. I think that these trucking companies take into account lots of other things. And, you know, in modeling, in just using the shortest path, we're going to miss that, and we're going to assign trucks to the wrong roads, and we're going to end up with weird results. So our primary question was, you know, is the shortest path assignment appropriate? And we went out and we asked shippers and carriers. So we asked them, you know, how do you make decisions about routing? What are your priorities? We asked them to rank those priorities. And, you know, how does your decision making change in sort of a planning context or on a day-to-day basis? And so we surveyed 700 shippers and carriers in Washington State, which is a lot. And the short answer is yes, it's reasonable, because about 95% of them told us that their primary objective was, it's actually their second objective was minimizing cost. Some words that said that, minimizing travel time, minimizing cost. So what do you think their first objective was? So yeah, yes, essentially. So they said meeting customer requirements, right? Which sometimes we don't even say it because we take that for granted, right? Because if you were just trying to minimize distance, you wouldn't go at all, right? So of course, there's something you have to do, okay? And that so they said, well, the reason we're going is we are meeting customer requirements, and sometimes that means traveling at a particular time of day or taking a particular path, right? But once we've done that, once we've sort of met our obligation in a sense, then yes, of course we try to do that as cheaply as possible. But they have a bunch of different constraints, and actually those constraints vary, right, depending on what kind of truck you drive. If you have overweight loads, right, your network is different from somebody else's network. And if you have hazardous materials, right, the network that's available to you is different. So you do see a different assignment, okay, but their objective is still the same. So the short answer is yes, it is reasonable that if we got the constraints right, and we got the network available to them right, if we did a shortest path assignment, we would be a very reasonable representation of what their path would truly be. So we also learned sort of we looked very closely at whether or not people thought about time or distance. And I think you can use time because in places where we don't have congestion, right, the trucking firms talk about distance, right, minimizing distance. And that, as long as your speed is reliable, right, that very quickly translates into time. In urban regions, it doesn't because we have congestion, or I'm oversimplifying. We don't just have congestion in urban regions, but in general, right, if we're exposed to congestion, then they start thinking about travel time because it's not always cheapest to take the shortest route if that puts you through the most congested region. And this, so getting the network right, so assuming that all roads are available to all trucking firms is not smart, right? If we have a larger truck, right, we're going to choose a different path than if we have a more mobile, more nimble truck. And we can categorize them into these three groups, really, in terms of the way they think about routing decisions. And we call one of them long hauls. We do a cluster analysis and group these people based on how they make routing decisions. And the long haul people think about parking, and that is, I think, sort of overnight parking, rest stops, right? People who are traveling a long way have to have places to stop. And they're not available everywhere. So that's a concern of theirs. Support, right, if they find themselves out in the middle of nowhere and they need access to services. They think about distance. They also think about size and weight constraints because usually these are big trucks. It's not smart to take a very small truck and drive a very long way. And you have to have 3 of those instead of one big one. We have this what we call local delivery, who think about time, who think about when they think about routing, they think about access to those facilities, right? UPS trucks think about left turns. They think about sort of much more detailed access issues. And they're much more driven by customer requirements because those are often very service-oriented companies. And then we have this other group we call opportunistic small firms. They're generally owner-operators with a flatbed trailer who will basically do anything to get a load because they've paid for their truck and now they're just trying to bring in revenue. So they're usually going to go the shortest distance. They don't backhaul a lot because they're sort of they don't have the ability to link loads. They get a call and they go and take it back. So it's interesting and fun to actually talk individually with firms about how they make decisions. The other thing we've been working on, both in Oregon and Washington, is this idea of trying to come up with groups of carriers. So in the passenger world, we know there's sort of 5 things about you that we're going to use to estimate how you travel, right? Whether or not you have kids, big indicator of your travel patterns. Whether or not you have a job, right? Big indicator of your travel patterns. And we don't really have those things in our freight models, and so we're trying to look for sort of, what are, of course, there's actually, and everybody, or every firm is actually different, right? And every person is actually different. But we're willing to make some simplifications and put people into these sort of traveling categories to make some sense of the world. What would those be if we put freight carriers into those groups? And so we did a survey to get, because we don't have this kind of detailed information available any other way, and we're looking at people who might travel. We like carriers who make the same sort of travel decisions, right? They travel at the same time of day, or tend to. They might backhaul, so that's return empty with maybe the same rate. So because we're trying to model their traveling behavior. And then, I just presented, project is just ending, but we have identified clusters, and we have an n-dimensional space. There's lots of different ways you could cluster people, but we're recommending these clusters based on sort of where they are in the supply chain, so sort of raw materials versus delivery to retail and residences. So where you are in the supply chain, as well as a commodity, because those really drive a lot of equipment decisions and travel time sensitivity. So there's sort of a matrix that we would recommend.
And that puts us
Yeah.
at our ending time.
Good.
Thank you very much for squeezing those in.